I first noticed something was wrong with my neighbors the night I saw the man standing in their window. It was nearly 2 and I'd just gotten home from work, exhausted, ready to collapse into bed. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of an old complex. Not the worst place, but the walls are thin and the floors creak even when nobody's walking on them. The kind of building where you learn to ignore strange noises. That night, as I locked my car and looked up, I saw him. He was standing perfectly still behind the sheer white white, a far might year. The glow of a single lamp outlined his silhouette, tall, thin shoulders slightly hunched. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel him looking at me. I hesitated. The thing is, no one lived in 3B. At least they weren't supposed to. The previous tenants, a couple in their 50s, had moved out 3 months ago. The place had been empty ever since. I'd seen the landlord showing it to a few prospective renters, but no one had moved in. And yet, there he was, standing, watching. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the unnatural stillness in the air. The street was silent, no wind, no distant hum of traffic. Just me, my pulse in my ears, and that figure at the window. Then, without warning, the light in 3 clicked off. The window went completely black. I stood there for a long time, staring up at the darkened apartment, my body screaming at me to move, to go inside, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Eventually, I did, and that was my first mistake. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe the landlord had finally rented the place out. Maybe I just caught a glimpse of someone moving in. Logical explanations. But when I left for work, I noticed something strange. The door to 3B had no signs of activity. No moving boxes, no scuff marks from furniture being dragged inside. Just the same dusty welcome mat that had been there for months. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, though, something changed. I had just sat down to eat when I heard its soft, deliberate knocking. Not on my door, on the wall. 3 slow, rhythmic taps. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. My apartment shares a wall with 3B. I wasn't used to hearing anything from that side, but now, I waited. A minute passed, then another. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from right where my headboard rested against the wall. I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. It had to be a coincidence, right? A pipe settling, the building shifting. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. Silence. Then shuffle, shuffle, shuffle. I yanked away from the wall like I'd been burned. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't the building. Someone was in 3B. The next morning, I left early, hoping to run into them. Sure enough, as I stepped into the hallway, I saw them, a man and a woman, standing just outside 3B's door. The man was tall, thin, with greasy dark hair and pale skin that looked almost gray under the fluorescent hallway light. The woman was shorter, frail-looking, with limp blonde hair and downcast eyes. Something about them made my stomach twist. They weren't carrying anything. No groceries, no moving boxes, nothing. They just stood there. When the man noticed me, he smiled. Or at least, I think he did. The corners of his mouth stretched upward, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning," he said. His voice was too smooth, too polite, like he was imitating what a normal person should sound like. The woman didn't look up. "Ah, hey," I managed. "You guys just move in?" The man kept staring. "Yes." A long pause. I waited for him to say more, maybe introduce himself, ask my name, but he just kept staring. That too wide grin plastered on his face. The woman shifted slightly, her hands twitching at her sides. "Well," I said, forcing a laugh. "Welcome to the building." The man's smile widened. "Thank you." Then, at the exact same time, both of them turned and walked into 3, shutting the door behind them without another word. I stood there for a moment, my skin crawling. Something was very, very wrong. That night, the noises started again. At first, just soft movements, shuffling, furniture being dragged. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something new, scratching. Not on the wall this time, on my front door. Light at first, like fingertips tracing the wood, then harder, more insistent. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body on fire. Then knocking, slow, measured. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the peephole. My breath was shaky, my hands clammy as I pressed my eye to the glass. At first, I saw nothing, just the dimly lit hallway. Then the woman, the one from 3B, stepped into view. She was standing too close to my door, her head tilted at a sharp angle. Her lips were moving, but I couldn't hear anything. Then her eyes snapped up and locked onto the peephole. I stumbled backward, nearly falling. The knocking stopped. For a long time, I just stood there, heart hammering. Finally, after what felt like hours, I forced myself to check again. She was gone. But on my door, scratched deep into the wood, were 3 jagged marks, like fingernails. I need to leave. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called the landlord. The couple in 3B, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. When did they move in? A pause. 3B? He repeated. No one's rented that unit yet. I felt my stomach drop. No, that's not right, I said quickly. I met them yesterday. They told me they moved in. A longer pause. Sir, the landlord said carefully, no one's lived in 3 since the last tenants moved out. The unit's still empty. I couldn't breathe. I turned and stared at my wall, at the deep scratches on my door, at the apartment next to mine, where no one was supposed to live. And then, as I stood there, my phone still pressed to my ear, I heard them knock. Tap, 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 from inside my apartment. I always thought I was a good neighbor. Not the overly friendly kind who bakes cookie kites you bake you eyes, or organizes barbecues. Respectful. I kept to myself, never blasted music late at night, took in my trash bins on time, the bare minimum to live peacefully in a suburban neighborhood. So when I moved into my new place, a modest rental at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, I expected the same from those around me. At first, that seemed to be the case. But then, little things started happening, and I began to understand. I wasn't welcome here. The first sign was small, easy to dismiss. I'd been in the house for just a few days, still unpacking, still getting used to the unfamiliar creaks of the place. One morning, I stepped outside to grab the mail and found a note tucked under my doormat. A single sheet of paper, neatly folded. At first, I thought it was from a delivery driver, maybe a missed package. But when I unfolded it, my stomach tightened. The words were scrawled in jittery black ink, written in sharp, uneven strokes. Keep the noise down. No greeting, no signature, just that. I frowned, glancing around. The street was empty. Sunlight streamed through the trees, painting dappled shadows over the pavement. Birds chirped, and a lawn sprinkler hissed softly in the distance. Noise? What noise? I barely had furniture in the house. I didn't even own a TV yet. The only sound I could think of was the occasional creak of the old wooden floors beneath my feet. Brushing it off as some passive-aggressive nonsense, I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. That was my first mistake. I met my neighbors that evening. I was out back trying to decide if the rusted fence between my yard and the next was salvageable when I felt eyes on me. I turned. A woman stood in the yard next door, half hidden behind her porch, half hidden behind hard grapevine. Mid-40s, graying blonde hair, 40s, graying blonde hair. Her expression was unreadable. Not exactly hostile, but not friendly either. I gave a small wave. Hey, you should be careful. Her voice cut through the air, flat and emotionless. I blinked. Sorry. She nodded toward my house. It doesn't like new people. I let out a short, awkward laugh. What doesn't? She just stared. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into her house, slamming the sliding door behind her. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, I woke to a sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but once I did, I couldn't ignore it. A slow, deliberate scraping. It was coming from inside the walls. I sat up, heart thudding. Mice, maybe, or the house settling. Holding my breath, I pressed my ear to the wall. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then tap, 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 tap. Something knocked back. I jolted away, my skin crawling. I didn't sleep after that. The second note came 2 days later. This time, it was taped to my front door. You need to leave. No explanation, no context. I stood there, gripping the paper so hard it crumpled. This wasn't normal. That night, I locked every door, every window, left the lights on, told myself I was being paranoid. At around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not outside, Inside, slow, deliberate steps moving through the hall. I barely breathed, gripping the blankets in white-knuckled fists. My bedroom door was closed, but the footsteps stopped just outside it. Then the doorknob turned. I shot out of bed, flipping on the lamp. The sound stopped instantly. For a long time, I didn't move. Finally, heart pounding, I forced myself to open the door. The hallway was empty, but in the center of the floor, where no one should have been, was another note. A single word, written in that same frantic handwriting. Go. I was done. I decided the next morning I'd call the landlord, break the lease, crash on a friend's couch if I had to. But before I could start packing, there was a knock at the door. I jumped, my pulse spiking. Through the peephole, I saw the woman from next door. For a moment, I hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, I opened the door. She didn't step inside, just stood there, expression unreadable. "You found the notes," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Her gaze flickered past me, toward the dim interior of my house. "You need to listen to them." My stomach twisted. "Who's leaving them?" A long silence. Then, "It doesn't matter." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You have to leave before it decides you belong here." My throat was dry. "What?" A sound cut me off. A soft creak from somewhere inside the house. My body locked up. She went rigid. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I wanted to call after her, demand answers, but I couldn't move, because behind me, from the empty hallway, I heard breathing, slow, shallow, right behind me. I slammed the door shut and ran. I didn't pack, didn't think. I just grabbed my keys and bolted for the front door. But as I yanked it open, something stopped me. A movement in the corner of my eye. There, in the hallway. My skin went cold. The attic hatch was open. A long, narrow rope hung from it. And, at the very bottom of the rope, was a noose. Like someone had left it for me. That was it. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, tearing out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I called the landlord the next morning. Told him I was terminating the lease. I didn't care about the deposit. He didn't sound surprised. "I understand," he said. I almost hung up, but something made me ask. "I wasn't the first, was I?" Silence. Then, softly, "No, you weren't. I don't know who or what was in that house. But I know one thing for sure. It didn't want me there. Because I was never supposed to move in. I was trespassing. And if I had stayed any longer, I don't think I ever would have left. I always considered myself a good judge of character. You don't get to your mid-30 or mid-though. You don't dingle mid-30s without learning a 30s being pure about reading too about. My name's Daniel, and I live alone in a quiet little neighborhood. I like it that way, peaceful, predictable. That's why I moved here in the first place. So when the house next door went up for sale last fall, I kept a close eye on it had been vacant for months, gathering dust and weeds, and I was eager to see who my new neighbors would be. A family maybe, an elderly couple, someone normal, someone quiet. Then came them. I first saw them on a Wednesday afternoon, unloading a moving truck as the autumn sky dimmed to burnt orange. A man and a woman early 40s, maybe dressed too formally for moving day. He wore a neatly pressed button-up and slacks. She had on a long, flowing dress. They looked out of place. I went out to introduce myself, as any good neighbor would. The man who introduced himself as Harris shook my hand with an odd stillness. His wife, Elaine, barely glanced at me, offering only a polite nod before returning to the house. "Nice to meet you," I said, trying to be friendly. "If you need anything, just let me know." Harris smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you, Daniel," he replied. I hadn't told him my name yet. That should have been my first red flag. At first, they kept to themselves. No housewarming party, no housewarming party, no friendly chit-chat. Just silence. I tried not to take it personally. Some people are just private. But there was something off about them. For starters, I never saw them leave. No morning commutes, no grocery runs, no walks around the block. Their car sat in the driveway, unmoved, gathering leaves, and their house, the blinds were always drawn, the curtains always shut. One night, as I was taking my trash to the curb, I noticed something strange. The house was completely dark, no lights on, no glow from the windows. But as I turned to head back inside, I caught a flicker of movement. Behind one of the upstairs windows, a silhouette stood motionless, watching me. I froze, my pulse quickening. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, shadowy figure against the pale curtain. It didn't react to being seen, just stood there. I looked away for half a second. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just Harris looking out, maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But a sinking feeling settled in my stomach, and for the first time, I wondered if I should be concerned. Then the noises started. It began subtly whispers in the dead of night. But as the nights went on, the whispers became closer, like they were seeping through the walls. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke to something scratching, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging against wood. It was coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. Their wall. I sat up, heart pounding. The scratching continued, rhythmic and steady, for nearly a full minute, in silence. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I decided to confront them. Maybe they were night owls. Maybe they had some kind of pet scratching at the walls. I needed an explanation. I knocked on their door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I was about to turn away when I heard movement inside. A slow shuffle of feet approaching the door. I waited, breath held. The door opened just a crack. Harris stood there, peering out at me with unreadable eyes. The dim interior of the house stretched behind him, dark and hollow. No furniture, no decor, just empty shadows. "Hey," I started, trying to keep my voice casual. "I was just wondering if you guys have been hearing anything strange at night, scratching maybe, or whispering." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, in that same unsettlingly calm voice, he said, "No, Daniel, we haven't heard anything at all." The way he said my name sent a chill up my spine. I forced a chuckle. "Ah, weird. Well, if you..." Before I could finish, the door clicked shut. I stood there, staring at the peeling wood. I knew without a doubt that he was lying. That night, I locked every door and window. I'd barely slept, ears straining for any sound. Hours passed in silence. Then, just as I started to drift off, a creak. A soft, deliberate creak, like someone stepping onto my floor. My breath caught. The sound was coming from the hallway. I reached for my phone, heart hammering, and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the doorway. The door was open. I knew I had closed it before bed. I sat up slowly, scanning the room. My closet door stood slightly ajar. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, a whisper, right next to my ear. "We hear you too, Daniel." I scrambled out of bed, crashing to the floor as I fumbled for the light switch. The room flooded with harsh yellow light. Empty. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes, searching the house. No signs of forced entry, no one inside. They assured me it was probably just a bad dream. Stress, maybe. I knew better. The next day, I noticed something strange outside. The house next door, the one Harris and Elaine had supposedly moved into, the for sale sign was back up. I called the real estate agent, pretending to be an interested buyer, and that's when she told me. The house had been vacant for over a year. No one had bought it. No one had moved in. No one lived there. I still don't know who or what was watching me from that upstairs window, but I moved out the next week, and I never looked back. I think someone is living in my neighbor's house. That shouldn't be possible. The house has been empty for months. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, but now, I'm not so sure, because last night, I saw a face in the window, and whoever it was, they were looking right at me. I moved into this neighborhood 6 months ago. It's a quiet, tree-lined street, one of those places where nothing really happens. Most of the houses are older, well-maintained, and the people here keep to themselves. That suited me just fine. I had just gotten out of a bad relationship, and all I wanted was a fresh start. The house next door had been empty when I moved in. A for sale sign sat crookedly in the overgrown yard, and through the windows, I could see bare floors and dust-covered counters. The place wasn't abandoned, but it had that hollow feeling of a home no one has lived in for a long time. At first, I didn't think much about it. I was too busy settling into my own place, unpacking, getting furniture, learning which floorboards creaked when I walked across them at night. Then, a few weeks ago, I started noticing things. It started with the lights. I was taking the trash out one evening when I saw a faint glow from the upstairs window. I stopped staring. The house was supposed to be empty, but there, on the second floor, a soft, flickering light pulsed against the glass, like the glow of a TV screen. I frowned, shifting uneasily. Maybe a realtor had come to check on the place, or maybe someone had finally bought it. I didn't think much of it until I saw it again the next night, and the next. Always the same window, always that faint glow, never any movement, never any sign of life. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then, about a week ago, I saw something that I couldn't explain. It was late. I was sitting in my living room, watching a movie with the lights off, when a movement outside caught my eye. I turned toward the window and froze. A shadow was standing in the upstairs window next door, a dark shape motionless against the pale glow of the room behind it. Someone was inside the house. I sat there, heart hammering. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there watching. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Told myself it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But that night, something else happened. Someone knocked on my door. I had just gotten into bed when I heard it, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, pulse racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a long moment, I didn't move. Then, cautiously, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the front door. I peered through the peephole. Nobody was there. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing but the wind, the faint rustle of tree branches. Finally, after what felt like forever, I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The porch was empty, but there, on the doormat, was a piece of paper. I bent down, my fingers shaking as I picked it up. Scrawled in jagged black ink, 5 simple words stared back at me. "Don't look at the windows." I slammed the door shut and locked every bolt. After that, things escalated. I started hearing noises at night, soft tapping against my windows, a shuffling sound on my porch. I stopped going near the windows after dark, stopped checking when I heard a noise. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it would stop if I ignored it. But last night, it got worse, because last night, I saw a face. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had woken up thirsty and was making my way to the kitchen when something made me stop. A feeling, an overwhelming sense that I was being watched. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. And there, in the upstairs window of the house next door, was a face. Pale, motionless, eyes wide and empty, and it was staring directly at me. I choked on my own breath, stumbling backward. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then, just like before, the figure vanished. I didn't sleep. I didn't even go back to my bedroom. I sat in my living room, every light in the house on, waiting for the sun to rise. This morning, I decided enough was enough. I called the realtor's office, the one with the sign out front of the empty house. An older woman answered. I tried to sound casual, asking if the place had been sold, if anyone had moved in recently. She paused. "That house?" she said finally. "It's been vacant for almost 2 years now." I gripped the phone tighter. "Are you sure? I thought I saw—" "You must be mistaken." Her voice had a strange edge to it. I hesitated. "There haven't been any, squatters, break-ins?" Silence. Then so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "You should move." A chill ran through me. "What?" I whispered. "You should move," she repeated. "They don't like new people." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart